Welcome, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you all for this talk, which is entitled A New Era, German Foreign Policy After Merkel. I'm Daniel Stockmar. I'm a professor at the School of Political Studies at the University of Ottawa, and I hold the Konrad Adenauer Research Chair in Empirical Democracy Studies. As a German national, I'm super excited to hear what are expectations of other nationals towards German foreign policy in the years to come. And we have two great panelists today. First will be Jana Puglierin, and she has been the head of the European Council on Foreign Relations office in Berlin, and she's a senior fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations since 2020. She also directs the ECFR's Reshape Global Europe project, which seeks to develop new strategies for Europeans to understand and engage with the changing international order. And she holds, among other things, a PhD from Bonn University in Germany. The second speaker is Rafael Loss. He's the coordinator for Pan-European Data Project of the European Council on Foreign Relations Reshape Global Project, which seeks to develop new strategies for Europeans to understand and engage with the changing international order. He also works on German and European foreign policy, security and defense, climate policy, transatlantic relations, and nuclear policies and arms control. Both will talk for about 20 to 25 minutes. Their talk has the following structure. They will first give a little bit of a historical overview, then talk about the election results, and then talk about expectation towards the new German governments and their foreign policy. Without further ado, I will hand over to Jana, who will be the first speaker.
Thanks very much, Daniel. Actually, I will.
Oh, sorry, Rafael.
No
okay.
But it's a pleasure to be back in Ottawa. I was an exchange student, I told Daniel earlier, in 2013, so it's particularly exciting for me to talk to you today. What we thought we would do is discuss European expectations to what the next German government, what the stepping down of Angela Merkel means for Europe in a broader sense. We at ECFR earlier this summer conducted a public opinion poll in 12 European countries, including Germany, France, Bulgaria, Austria, Portugal, Denmark, Spain, Sweden, Poland, Hungary, Italy, and the Netherlands. And with this quite extensive sample, we assessed what European views were on Angela Merkel's leadership and what their expectations were towards the next German government. As Daniel said, our talk will be structured in three parts. Jana will kick us off with the first part. I will share my screen momentarily so that you can all see what we have come up with in our poll.
So I'll take over from here. Hi, I'm Jana. I'm very glad to be here, at least virtually. And I'll talk about how Europeans perceive German leadership in Europe. It's basically a taking stock exercise of the Merkel era, and we wanted to know how much do Europeans actually trust Germany, how do they access what Germans have done under Merkel, and what is the overall perception. And actually our overall findings are very positive, and I think will please Angela Merkel a lot, because first of all, this is one of the most important slides. We had asked Europeans the hypothetical question whom they would vote for as a president of Europe, a post that doesn't exist, if only two candidates were at the ballot sheet. So, and as you can see, in all the countries where we polled, that would have been an easy win for Angela Merkel. It's not even close in any member state, and also in France, although maybe support for Angela Merkel is nearly lowest amongst the countries where we polled. There, the distance to Emmanuel Macron is still quite striking. So Angela Merkel is basically, the uncrowned president of Europe. Next slide. So we actually wanted to find out whether the perception of Germany has something to do with the attachment towards Europe. So whether Germany was a polarizing factor, and whether people with different attitudes towards Europe would perceive Germany differently. And this is actually the case. So we asked people how much they basically feel European, how important their European identity or being European is to them. And those people who feel European were much more likely to vote for Angela Merkel than those who are hesitant or who do not feel European. So overall, the more people felt European, the more they embraced a European identity, the more positive the image of Germany was. And we not only show this with this one question, but also when it comes to President of the European Commission being a German. Another question we had asked is what kind of effect Angela Merkel had on the world stage. So we asked people whether there would have been more or less conflict in the world if Angela Merkel had not been the Chancellor of Germany. And so overall, I think one can safely say that many people think that there would have been more conflict without Merkel. So Merkel was a stabilizing, pacifying figure internationally, but even more people thought that it doesn't really make a difference. And I think personally, whereas Merkel is always or often referred to as the leader of the free world, and especially after Trump was elected, kind of her perception was very much kind of that she was holding the world together, the liberal international order. When it comes to German foreign policy more concretely, a lot of people don't feel the difference. And we thought as analysts looking at the results that this has also to do with the fact that Germany in many conflicts in the world is not really present. So the very positive image of Germany's past, the overall balance sheet of the Merkel government is very positive. But looking at the future, people are much more reluctant. So we asked the question whether Germany's golden age was in the past, present, or still to come. And as you can see here, mostly the Germans are of the opinion that their glorious days are to a certain extent over. So 52% of Germans, but also of Austrians, think that Germany's golden age lies in the past. The kind of in most countries, this was actually also the strongest sentiment. Some people think that Germany's golden age is today, especially in Spain, in Poland, in Portugal. Numbers are quite high, especially compared to what the Germans think about themselves. But not many people think that Germany's golden age is in the future. And I think especially also the data from Germany can be interpreted in a way that after 16 years of Merkel, a lot of Germans also feel that they had really wonderful years and that they were very little shaken by the crises that Europe has seen, the crisis in the Eurozone, the migration crisis, even though that had a huge impact on Germany. But whereas Germany's neighbors struggled a lot, Germany had many good years in the past. And I think now people understand that that might not continue forever. And the coronavirus crisis, I think in Germany has also shown that there is a lack of innovation, investment in public infrastructure, and that the challenges ahead also for the German small and medium enterprises who heavily rely on export, that the conditions for all of this might change in the future. So the question we had is, if Germans themselves are not confident in their own future, how much will they be willing to lead? Next slide. Oh, yeah, I hand over to Rafael.
Thanks very much, Jana. In the second part, I'll recap briefly the election results. On September 26th, Germans took to the polls and elected a new parliament, out of which will emerge the next German government. But first, let me discuss with you briefly what the interests were of Germans that were going to the polls. So if you followed the elections results, then you might know that climate issues, the COVID crisis, the social question were sort of driving the headlines over the past couple of weeks of the election campaign. We see that neatly mapping on the party spectrum as well. So if you look, for example, at supporters of the Greens, then at 29%, they said that failure to act on climate change would be the greatest threat to Europe, whereas voters of the extreme right AfD were more concerned with a major recession or rising unemployment. Similarly, voters of the liberal FDP, voters of the conservative CDU had the highest support for failure to vaccinate a majority of the adults. So these were sort of the concerns and sentiments that were driving German voter decisions. We also asked in an earlier poll about their own expectations for what Europe should be on the world stage. We also see here a neat divide between the liberal FDP, which overwhelmingly supports an open and thriving single market, contrasting that with the Greens, where you have an overwhelming majority in support for Europe being a beacon of democracy and human rights on the world stage. So much to aspirations and concerns for Germans now. How did they vote on Sunday? We see that the SPD, center-left party, came in first with 26% of the vote. We also see that Angela Merkel's party, the CDU, compared to 2017, lost a significant number of votes. In fact, the 24% that they received 2 weeks ago were their worst results since 1949, since the creation of the Federal Republic. The Greens received their strongest results in turn at 15%. Unfortunately for them, that was far lower than they were polling this spring. At their height, they had polling numbers around 28%, so a bit of a mixed bag for the Greens here. The FDP made some gains. The extreme right AfD and light blue here lost some votes, although it seems that they have consolidated themselves as part of the German political spectrum. And then the left party, which is Germany's far left party, just barely got into the new parliament. They didn't make it across our 5% threshold, but because of some technicalities, they'll still be able to send a couple of representatives into the next Bundestag. In terms of seats, the voter distribution produces a parliament that will look like that, with the largest faction being the SPD, of course, followed by the CDU. The two together barely make it across 50% of the electorate, which is a significant development. If you take the long view in German politics, in previous elections, the two sort of centrist Volksparteien or big all 10 parties, big 10 parties, were able to regularly capture 70+% of votes, and now they barely make it across 50%. The Greens will be the third largest party group, followed by the FDP, the AfD, the left party, and there's going to be one representative of a regional minority as well, Danish peoples in northern Germany. In terms of coalition options for the next German government, what seems most likely at the moment is a so-called traffic light coalition, red, green, and yellow, made up of the center-left SPD, the Green Party, and the FDP. It seems that voters entrusted Olaf Scholz, who leads the SPD and was their chancellor candidate, with leading the next German government, considering that Armin Laschet, who led the CDU in the election campaign, lost a considerable number of votes. A so-called Jamaica coalition between the CDU, the Greens, and the FDP would produce a smaller majority, but nonetheless would be possible. We also could see a return of a grand coalition but with the chancellorship flipping from the CDU, Angela Merkel's party, to the SPD, party of Olaf Scholz, who had so far been the vice chancellor and finance minister of Germany. There was also talk during the election campaign, particularly among conservatives, mobilizing a sort of far left scarecrow coalition between the SPD, the Greens, and the far left party. But they won't make it across the majority threshold in the Bundestag, so that's a non-option. Now looking at European expectations toward the next German government, after having discussed a bit how they viewed the Merkel years and looking at how Germans produced a new parliament that will elect a new government in a couple of weeks, excuse me. We'll now look at what Europeans expect of said government. First of all, we see that Europeans tend to trust Germany most when it comes to economic and financial issues, as well as democracy and human rights in Europe. They trust Germans less so with leadership on defense and security, and least when it comes to handling relations with the major powers in the world. The United States, Russia, and China. There's some disappointment that seems to be mapping on Germany when we look at how Europeans view German leadership in various areas. What we also see in the data, though, is that European trust in Germany when it comes to defending interests in the economic and financial realm, then that this sort of broadly covers all corners of Europe, with Hungary and Spain, the Netherlands, and Bulgaria, each having high marks. Italy, as you can see, and Poland coming with the lowest approval ratings for Germany on economic issues. A similar picture we have when we look at German leadership on democracy and human rights. Here we have Hungarians supporting German leadership on the issue, Danes, the Dutch, the Spanish as well, with lowest marks again coming in from Italy and Poland. When we look at the sort of genuine foreign policy portfolios, then we see that Poles, Italians, Bulgarians tend to trust German leadership on relations with the three great powers least. To our surprise, Hungarians tend to be most approving, but the Netherlands, Germans themselves, and respondents from Spain Germany's golden age was in the past, in the present, or in the future. Then we see that most people that believe that Germany's golden age is in the past also tend to approve of German leadership much less. People that believe that Germany's golden age is today or in the future tend to trust German leadership on most, across all policy issues, policy portfolios much more. The only reverse results we get when we asked whether Europeans trusted Germany in none of these policy portfolios, where approval ratings naturally are much higher from people that believe that Germany's golden age is in the past. There's also a bit of a gap in perception when it comes to German self-perception and the perception of others towards Germany. There's a large gap when it comes to defense and security issues. Here, only 20% of Germans say that they trust Germany to defend European interests in this area, whereas 29% of respondents from the 11 other countries say the same. We have a similar gap, although somewhat narrower, on questions of economic and financial issues. The gap is smallest in handling relations with China and handling relations with Russia. That's not quite as comforting because trust in German leadership is quite low on these issues. But at least Europeans and Germans both believe that they don't trust German leadership very much here. We also see that there is a certain gap in perception between handling relations with the US, where German self-perception is much higher than that of other Europeans, and democracy and human rights, where there's a considerable gap as well. Now, what we made of these results are that, first of all, the next German government not only has a mandate from its voters internally, but also from other Europeans, that there is an expectation that a renewed German leadership could provide Europe with important impulses on a variety of policy areas. Most considerably, that could include issues such as climate policy, European social question, but also more traditional questions like defense and security and economic leadership. Eurozone reform, for instance, is a question that has been simmering in the background for quite a while, and where we have varied views across Europe and need for leadership to find a common position on how to move forward. But we'll leave it there and look forward to your, well, there's one more slide I'll cover, which is certainly one of the most interesting ones. The question of whether Europeans expect Germany to become more nationalistic or more focused on helping other Europeans. And here Europeans have a outsized positive self-perception, with 36% of Germans saying that they will be more focused on helping other Europeans, whereas only 25% of other Europeans believe the same. Here the skepticism and belief that Germany would take a nationalistic turn outweighs the more positive note on Germany focusing on helping other Europeans. But now I'll leave it and we can turn towards your questions.
Thank you so much, Rafael and Jana. What I suggest is that people can either raise their hands, and if you ask a question, I ask you to be relatively brief so we can get to a lot of questions. Another possibility is to put a question in the chat, and I'll try to read it. So depending on how many people actually want to ask questions, we can do individual questions, or if I see that more people ask questions, we'll do rounds of questions. So without further ado, the floor is open for any questions. And if nobody has a question, I can start with a question. And my question would be, do you think that the public opinion, I mean, you did the survey in the spring and summer, if I got it correctly, and at the time it was very likely that we would have a Christian Democratic and Green coalition. That was kind of the expectation. Now things have changed. So do you think this kind of new, or this change in chancellor and this change in coalition should have or would have any impact if you had redone the survey, let's say now?
Maybe I try a first answer. I think that was not what motivated people when they answered our survey, because so the questions were really very much about Merkel's legacy and about the Germany of the past 16 years, and then also about the future. But I think that people did not have a concrete coalition in mind, but very much the Germany they knew. What I think had a decisive effect is the recovery fund and Germany's positioning throughout the coronavirus crisis, because the huge level of trust that Germany enjoys all over Europe was something that we found very surprising, because it's not only the so-called frugal countries in the north trust Germany, but also very much, for example, Spain and Portugal. So we thought, when we analyzed it, that the results would have been much different if we had polled at the height of the Eurozone crisis, for example, and that many people, I think, have a more positive image of Germany, especially in the European South, because of the recovery fund. That's how we explained the very positive numbers from all over Europe. Maybe Rafael has a different opinion.
No, not really, but maybe to add, I think your point is well taken, and also reflects the positioning of the parties themselves earlier this year when they published their party manifestos and election programs. I think there was some hedging going on, and a wide expectation that the CDU and the Greens would form the next government. Could see language in some of the SPD left party programs that indicated that they were preparing for being in the opposition, whereas the Green Party did a lot of hedging to open themselves up to a potential coalition with the CDU, I think.
Okay, thank you so much. I see two questions in the question and answer box. These are very different questions. I will read them both, and then each of you can decide which one to respond. The first question is, could you please elaborate on why both German far right and far left had less support than some expected? And the second one, what's the fate with probably the new coalition of the Nord Stream project? For the pipeline project, if people are unfamiliar.
So maybe I start with the second question. I have some thoughts on the first one as well, but I'll add them later. So on Nord Stream 2, we face different opinions in the coalition that is about to come to life, hopefully. I mean, I don't want to see the same situation that we experienced in 2017, when kind of 6 weeks after the negotiations started, the Liberals stepped out of the room and never came back. I think that is very bad for German democracy. So anyhow, so if we assume that there will be a traffic light coalition sometime down the road, let's assume December, there will be different opinions on Nord Stream 2, and we need to find, or the parties need to find a compromise. So the SPD has been a dyed-in-the-wool supporter of Nord Stream 2 from the very beginning. It is a Sigmar Gabriel project, our former SPD minister. There was not an inch of criticism, and the conviction that we need the pipeline in order to in order to manage our so-called Energiewende, so our exiting reliance on nuclear energy, and then also exiting coal. So a lot of reasons why this is a brilliant project. Whereas the Greens are deeply skeptical, because they don't think, or they are afraid of Russian blackmailing, but also for values reasons, because they observe very closely the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, the recent Duma elections, and they think that we cannot reward Russia with a pipeline, and we cannot pretend that nothing had changed. The FDP is also very critical. They were calling for a moratorium previously. So the Greens wanted to end the pipeline project, the FDP wanted a moratorium, and the SPD wanted to continue business as usual. The thing is that the pipeline is now finished, and I don't see any way how to stop it now. I think it will start working, because now that it's finished, I think none of the politicians will really object and the SPD, the Greens and the Liberals don't make this the hill they want to die on in the coalition negotiations. So that's why I think this is pretty much done. What is challenging, however, for the next German government will be kind of the implications now. So Germany, when Germany negotiated with the United States and got left off the hook when it came to sanctions, I think Germany took over a huge chunk of responsibility for what's happening in Ukraine. And so I think it remains to be seen how the new government will develop its broader Russia policy, and then also its broader approach towards Ukraine. Another reason why I think that we won't see the death of Nord Stream 2 is the kind of rising gas prices in energy prices in Europe and in Germany. And so I think it will be a very tough autumn and very tough winter anyway, because the Greens also have this, they want to have a lot of climate protection measures in the coalition treaty, and they want Germany to change its also dependency on fossil energy and all this radically, but at the same time, this will be very difficult now because the ordinary German citizen will have to pay much more for energy. And I think it will be very difficult circumstances also for the Green Party program to come to life. Rafael, do you take the extremes and maybe add to what I said?
Yeah, no, I don't think I have anything to add to Jana's assessment of the Nord Stream 2 conundrum that Germany faces now. But with respect to the far right and far left parties, so the AfD, the extreme right party, and the Die Linke, the left party in the parliament, I think there are two factors at play in both parties. I think one is an unusual personification or personalization of the German election campaign. So we saw a strong focus on the three candidates, Armin Laschet of the CDU, Olaf Scholz of the SPD, and then because of this high polling that I mentioned earlier for the Greens, they felt compelled to nominate a chancellor candidate with Annalena Baerbock as well. And a lot of the campaign focused on those three candidates and how they were sort of moving up and down the approval ratings, their personal ambitions and failings to some extent as well. And the smaller parties to some extent lost out here because they didn't receive quite as much attention, which points, I think, to an unfortunate sort of Americanization of German politics to some extent, because we've seen this in the US with very extensive election campaigns and a focus on the person over the substance of their policies. And then the second factor, I think, that contributed to their losses is internal dynamics. So both the Linke and the AfD suffered from personnel disputes at the very top and programmatic disputes over the specific direction. In addition, the AfD came under surveillance from the German Constitutional Protection Service, or our internal intelligence agency. And it's been sort of brandmarked by various lawsuits as an extreme right party. Some even can be rightfully called fascists. There's been struggles in some of the German states, political disputes there, the AfD playing a strong role. But nevertheless, as I said earlier, I think especially the AfD has sort of consolidated itself as part of the German political spectrum. If you look at Saxony and Thuringia, two of the former East German states, then in some areas they are the most prominent party, unfortunately, despite or because of their extreme right views. This is less strength of that party. They've received the most votes, but also lost some compared to 2017. But more significantly, it's a sort of erosion of the political center. So huge losses of the CDU all across Germany, some losses for the other parties as well, just elevated the position of the AfD to such an extent that they are a political force now in some Eastern German states.
Thank you both. So now I have another question, and this is the question: how do you think foreign policy should shift or develop vis-a-vis Russia and the United States under the likely traffic light coalition?
Is the question should or would?
Or what you expect, how it changes, or if it doesn't change. So basically, I think you should talk about what you expect would be the future.
Okay, I'm happy to talk about both, because it's not, it's unfortunately not the same. So I think, the good news is that the parties of the center, all four of them, or five, if you count the CDU, CSU as two parties, which one should, share a broad commitment to the transatlantic alliance and to the European Union and to a further integration process. So German foreign policy has a broad basis. It's not a contested topic. Of course, there are nuances, but the overall direction, multilateralism, rule of law, rules-based international order, as I said, European Union, close cooperation with the United States, but also always working in alliances and not no more Sonderwege, not going it alone. This is really widely shared. So I would say that on foreign policy more broadly, don't expect a major revolution. Don't expect the new government to put things on their head. However, there will be nuances, and what I said about Russia and Nord Stream is also true when it comes to China. So Olaf Scholz, candidate, the likely next chancellor of Germany, is campaigned on the continuity ticket, and also in foreign policy on China and Russia, very much emphasize the approach of the past. So the general secretary of the SPD recently said that he expects Germany's future China policy to look much more like Merkel's China policy than that of the United States. However, in the coalition, the smaller parties, again, led with Russia, are much more, if you want, hawkish. Or they are much more critical when it comes to China. They want to revise Germany's China policy. And that is, it's not only them, it's also the broader environment in Germany where the debate about China is significantly changing. So the BDI, the Association of the German Industry, has now issued the second report, very critical with China. And although there are big dependencies when it comes to the German automobile industry on the Chinese export market, business gets increasingly skeptical when it comes to doing business with China. So you will see different forces. There is a lot of pressure on Germany to change, also coming from the transatlantic relationship, of course, and expectations from other Europeans. I think there is really a lot of expectations that the next government Europeanizes its approach towards China much more than under the Merkel government. But still, don't expect that we rock the boat too much, because also the big foreign policy portfolios are dealt with in the chancellery. And so I think we will see nuances and new approaches, but no game changer when it comes to the big countries, the big powers, the United States, China and Russia. I think the new government will be committed to the transatlantic relationship. I have my personal doubts when it comes to the future of German security and defense policy under this new government, because the SPD and the Greens are very skeptical when it comes to spending 2% on defense. They reject this as a goal. They have been in the past very much in favor of exiting NATO's nuclear sharing arrangement, and this remains to be seen how that will be solved in the coalition treaty, and if Germany will procure the necessary fighter jets to be able to continue to stay within the nuclear sharing arrangement. This is an open question to me. And when it comes to relationships inside the European Union, I think that the first test case might be very soon, because there are new problems in the European Union when it comes to the rule of law in Poland. So this is an angle where I think the new government will depart from the Merkel government and be more critical within the European Union, upholding the rule of law. But overall, I think it will be more continuity than change.
Thank you.
I think if I may add a couple of points, looking beyond the three parties that will form the next coalition, I think there might be potential for especially the Greens in the government, but also the Bundestag, to become a stronger sort of polarizing voice in a way where we see more political discussion erupting than we did under Merkel, especially during the last 8 years. There were voices that expressed concern over the grand coalitions that Merkel led, suffocating the opposition in the Bundestag, because they were such huge political party groupings, and the opposition parties were not very united, because you had everything from the far left AfD to the Greens to the FDP to the left party being represented in the opposition, and huge disarray there. So rarely do you see a united opposition challenging the government on any issues. Now that the CDU likely will end up in opposition when they get out of their internal personnel and programmatic struggles that they currently face, then I think that there is a sort of viable opposition again, a strong, fairly large party grouping in the Bundestag that can challenge the government on foreign policy and other policy areas. And similarly, I think the sort of intellectual work that the Greens have done in opposition over the past couple of years on foreign policy portfolios puts them in a good position to sort of also shape the discourse, if not the outcomes that the next German government will produce. And that is an opening for Germany's allies and partners in Europe, but also beyond, to hook into those debates and maybe influence them to some extent on the margins.
Okay, thank you. I see two more questions. I think we do them because they're very different, so we do them one by one. So what do you think is, or how do you think is Germany heading in the relationship towards the UK? Do you think there will be a hardening of Germany's position towards the UK?
I think the one policy area where this election really doesn't make a difference is when it comes to Brexit. I was asked by a lot of people in the UK previously what the impact on Brexit would be. And so I think they are not very different. So Germany will, and Brexit is done, although there are kind of some leftovers, and Germany remains very critical when it comes to the Northern Ireland Protocol, and is very is very strict in that what had been agreed previously during the Brexit negotiations needs to be implemented. This is the German position. Overall, Germany is interested in having a good relationship with the UK, but will always define its relationship with the UK also through Brussels or via Brussels. It will always keep in mind the overall EU position. When it comes to working with the UK on a more flexible basis on foreign policy, security and defense policy, I think there is more openness and also willingness to work together. In Germany, there is not a significant fallout after the AUKUS deal, whereas things look completely different in France. And I think that will highly influence the future of the EU approach towards the UK when it comes to especially security and defense and cooperating in the future. But in Germany, there is no fallout. And Germany will continue or want to continue to work with the UK. The problem from a German perspective is that Germany would prefer this to happen very much through an institutional arrangement with the EU and via the EU, and not a kind of free-floating, and that's what the UK prefers. And Germany, I think, will engage with the UK also in other formats like the E3. It did so already in the past and will do so in the future. But Germany will try to avoid a further fragmentation of foreign security and defense policy in Europe in a lot of small formats outside EU and NATO, where kind of a couple of Europeans stick their heads together and decide stuff. This is not what the Germans encourage and will likely very much engage into. To a certain extent, yes, but it's not kind of that they are thrilled to see this happening.
Thank you. So we have a question about domestic politics more so than international politics. The question is, what do the three parties in the emerging traffic or in the potentially emerging traffic light coalition have in common? And does this coalition risk blocking decision-making in a very turbulent global context? So whoever wants to go.
Do you want to start for a change? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So I think what they have in common is a certain grand narrative. Jana mentioned that Olaf Scholz very much represented continuity. I agree, at least in an appearance he did on the campaign trail. He even adopted Angela Merkel's signature hand rhombus gesture for a photo shooting with a German magazine. He adopted a very sort of cautious weighing appearance as well. And so in order, I think, to signal this continuity in leadership style and moderating and so on and so forth. I also think that he combined this with a program of sort of moderate change. When we look at the Greens and the FDP, though, they were more open to a sort of transformational change approach in various areas. So I think that the three parties can certainly agree on a sort of modernization agenda that approaches the climate issue, that deals with digitization, that deals with tax reform, which affects all these areas, which also attacks the social question. Inequality has been rising in Germany, particularly in the context of the COVID crisis. And the next German government will need to work to close the gap again. So again, I think that the grand narrative of change and modernization is one that the three parties share. There are differences, you're right there, in the programmatic details. But even so, there's been a lot of commentary over the past weeks, focusing in particular on the Greens and the FDP, which sort of intellectually are very far apart, but over the past weeks have managed to put themselves in the driver's seat in these exploratory talks, because they'll represent a larger share of the next German government's Bundestag seats than the respective larger party, the SPD or the CDU, depending on the coalition that ends up being formed. And they've played this very well, close consultations and staking of claims and creating a certain framework where the two parties, and then added on the SPD, likely can agree on. And again, this framing of modernization is one where you can attach a lot of the individual preferences that the parties have expressed. There will be differences, of course, and all three parties have to appear at least as though they were sort of fighting tough to put their priorities into the coalition agreement in the end, because they also need to get the agreement through their own internal party processes and gain approval from their party bases, which tend to be a bit more radical generally than the establishment and the leadership. But I think also contributing to this is the fact that after 2017 and the experience that we had there with the negotiations between the CDU and the Greens and the FDP, and as Jana mentioned, the FDP jumping ship eventually, that this is something that none of the parties want to have repeated this time around, especially not the FDP, but also the Greens are very eager to end up in government and implement their agenda. And there's something similar can be said for the SPD as well. So I think all of them want to make it work, and there are differences, but there's also potential to agree on a grand narrative for the next government, I think.
Yeah, I don't see less of a grand narrative actually emerging. I agree with Rafael, and the party program of the SPD is much more about modernization and changing stuff than the candidate was. But still, I mean, this is not a marriage close in heaven. This is not, or made in heaven. This is not like in 1998 when the first red-green back then coalition took over, when they really had a project in mind that they wanted to implement, when it was all about the new left and the transformation of the German party system, to a certain extent moving the SPD very much to the center, and when this was also accompanied by a bigger phenomena that happened in the UK and happened in the United States this time. And back then the SPD got 40% of the votes and was very strong. This time it's actually not what the parties expected and prepared for previously, because I think the overall assessment for a long time, also from the Greens, was that they will end up in a CDU-led two-party coalition, like a black-green coalition. That's what they prepared for months. Whereas and the FDP then later thought that they would join this coalition. I think this is, but now, as Rafael said, I think they are really motivated to make this work, but it's not a natural alliance. The outlier here clearly is the FDP in many ways, but there are also issues between the SPD and the Greens. For example, on climate, basically the Greens and the Liberals are much more radical, or at least they share the goal, whereas the SPD has blocked many things or is opposing many things that the Greens have put forward, because yeah, because they thought it's not kind of socially digestible. And also when it comes to, for example, civil rights, the Greens and the Liberals are much closer than the Greens and the SPD. The Greens and the FDP have been campaigning basically against each other. They have kind of portrayed each other basically as the arch enemy, and they now need to come together, which they actually managed brilliantly so far. And they have something in common when it comes to, yeah, civil rights, modernization, digitalization, investments in infrastructure, education, and also we talked about this already, very much foreign policy. However, the big problem will be the role of the state, because for the Greens, the state should serve as investor, and debts are not a problem. I mean, it's kind of the idea is that if we don't take on debt now and invest, we will pay the price in the future. Whereas for the FDP, it's the other way around. So they don't want to see more debt. They don't want to see a strong state. So this is very much the philosophical problem with this coalition, that the Greens and to a certain extent also the SPD see a strong role of the state when it comes to regulating things, but also when it comes to financing things. And the FDP is very much against this. And the FDP will have will feel the need to deliver to their voters, because they won some voters over from the CDU, and now they need to deliver. So I think there will be some tough nuts to crack. I think we will see a coalition treaty, and we will see a functioning, or at least initially functioning coalition. But as the question indicated, I think on many fronts, we will not see as much progress as the SPD and the Greens hope for, because the FDP will block it. And so I have my doubts whether in practice these three parties will, whether everything will go smoothly and whether they will stay kind of very much in line for 4 years, but we'll see.
Thank you so much. We are close to the end of the hour. I see no more questions in the questions and answer bulletin. So if there's no last minute question, I want to thank very much Rafael and Jana for great insights, great data, and also their great responses to the questions. I want to thank the audience for participating and also asking very thoughtful questions. And yes, stay tuned. There will be other events from CIPS. So hopefully see you soon. And thanks for all for joining. And a big thank you to the two panelists, Rafael and Jana.